From Bitcoin, blockchain or distributed ledger technology to cryptocurrencies, tokens and initial coin offerings, it seems everyone involved has something to say, but can you really trust their advice? One man's had enough of weasel words and charlatans and is ready to give you impartial, independent analysis. With digestible blockchain bites, ICO analysis and need-to-know news on cryptocurrencies, author, speaker, transparency and clarity advocate and award-winning software innovator Barry James brings you Radio ICO.
And this is Barry James back for the Blockchain Bites programme on ICO Radio. And with me now is Ben Brown, who is a partner at DLA Piper and is a specialist in the tax implications, the emerging tax implications of ICOs and cryptocurrencies. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks very much, Mike. Good to be.
So this is a whole new area, isn't it? So breaking new ground. Tell us a bit about it.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, people are very familiar with the tax treatment of traditional financing methods. So I think people are very comfortable with the way that currency is taxed, and equally people are comfortable with the way that companies generally raise money. So if that's a share issuance or an issuance of bonds, something like that, there is a tax regime within which those types of transactions fit very clearly. I think the concern around cryptocurrencies is that because it's an area of the financial world that has developed so quickly, tax authorities generally are kind of racing to catch up. And that's true of HMRC in the UK as much as for tax authorities elsewhere around the world. So in the UK at the moment, there is a historic piece of HMRC guidance which I think was published in 2014, which talks about the tax treatment of Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies generally. And there have been one or two bits and pieces of guidance that have appeared since then on sort of a piecemeal basis that touch on ICOs. But I think the concern that we have from a tax perspective is that there is a bit of an analysis there on how cryptocurrencies in general work, but that analysis seems to tail off when it comes to ICOs, and there are some sort of significant uncertainties around the way in which they're taxed, which could lead to quite significant consequences in economic terms.
So, okay, bit of a mendacious question, but so there's no real tax code around this yet. So there's no tax to pay then.
Well, that's it would be nice if that was the answer. And in some senses, for individuals, that has been one of the answers that HMRC have come out with, because
really? Their
original piece of guidance said that transactions in cryptocurrencies can be so speculative in nature that they essentially amount to gambling. And gambling returns traditionally have not been subject to tax on individuals. So that piece of guidance is still out there, but I would be very, very cautious about relying on it. And certainly in the context of formalised capital raisings, I'm not sure that gambling has much to do with the picture anymore. You're absolutely right, there is no tax regime specifically applying to ICOs. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there is no tax. I think the difficulty is working out which particular tax regime ICOs need to be slotted into to work out what the tax consequences are. And that is something at the moment that it's very difficult to do, and there's no real guidance on which of the regimes, whether it's purely currency, whether it's debt, or whether it's a share, essentially an equity raising. There's no real guidance on that, and each of those three options can have different consequences.
Yeah, so we're kind of with the duck test, aren't we? Does it waddle like a duck? Does it quack? In which case it's a duck, but there's no clear one box in each case.
That's
that right?
That's probably right, and that's what the HMRC guidance, such as it is, tells you to do. It does say that the analysis will be highly fact-dependent. So I think at the moment, until we get some formal guidance, what you have to do is look at each transaction on its own terms, and as you say, you work out what it looks most like. And it may well be that you have something that really, to all intents and purposes, is economically a debt security. And I think the safest option in that situation is to assume that for tax purposes it is a debt security and will be taxed like one.
Yeah.
Equally for something that looks like an equity raising.
Yeah. One of the most interesting presentations I've seen on this, talk about the duck-billed platypus. I don't know whether you saw that one, which defies all categorisation or previous categorisation to the extent that until they actually were sent a sample, the people responsible for this as a Royal Society wouldn't accept that it existed, and even then they were looking very hard for the stitching.
Yeah.
Do you think we've got a duck-billed platypus here where there's going to have to be some new categorisation rather than just codification into the existing ones?
I think the platypus analogy is a good one because whilst I'm sure you can have some tokens which to all intents and purposes are shares or to all intents and purposes are debt, so smart contract technology allows all sorts of different features, and you may well end up with something that has some equity-like features, some debt-like features, and some currency-like features. And in that situation, you genuinely have got a platypus that you really can't shoehorn into any particular categorisation. And that's the sort of area where I think, at the very least, if there's not legislation, there'll need to be some quite comprehensive guidance from HMRC as to how these things are meant to work.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're with animals. Let's move into slightly sideways into ecology, or at least environments and tax environments. So I know they vary greatly. I know one particular ICO that I had some contact with and helped along the way. Were looking for the right jurisdiction, as they do, and having participants in Germany went to see whether that would be a great idea, and very quickly decided that they were going to lose about 2/3 of their funding within about the tax year, so that wasn't a great idea, and went elsewhere.
Yes.
Where does the UK sit? And also, looking ahead, what should the UK be looking to do here for the future of UK PLC?
I think that maybe the biggest concern is that ICO issuance proceeds are taxable, or potentially could be viewed as taxable on receipt of the issuance proceeds. Now, that's not something that is clearly the case, and in fact, if you look at an ICO as being comparable to a debt issuance or an equity issuance, in a traditional debt or equity issuance, you wouldn't get tax on the issuance proceeds, and so one would have thought that ought to be the approach in the UK as well. And there are some potential difficulties around that, and they're fairly technical, so I won't go into them. But I think what would be very helpful from the perspective of what HMRC can do is for them to put out some guidance which aligns capital raisings in the form of ICOs with more traditional capital raisings, and gives everybody comfort that actually people aren't going to lose 20% or 19% of the issuance proceeds at the moment of issuance. Yeah. So I think that's something that HMRC could quite quickly get to a view on and provide some comfort on.
Yeah, so clarity would help.
I think that's right.
But, kind of looking forward, one of the things I've been involved in is looking at the way that regulation works in particular, and, pushing both government and regulator for a smarter environment that is more supportive of innovation. Do you see any areas within the sort of tax realm? Because clearly this is, going to be something that is a global phenomenon. Do you see anything other than the clarity, which is absolutely, understand that?
Yes. Yeah.
What else should they at least consider?
I have to say, I think that the key point probably is around clarity. The only other thing that they may want to consider is that because of the nature of ICOs, because it's fintech, because it's IT based, it's a highly mobile industry, and I think the UK wants to have a successful and growing economy, and if HMRC want to support that and government policy wants to support that, they might want to think about the absolute tax rates or absolute tax treatment of ICO issuances, and make sure that actually the UK position is at least comparable, if not better, to similar competing economies. So, one, it's around clarity, but two, I think it is around absolute tax rates, because actually, if a large chunk of issuance proceeds is going to go to the UK government, whereas it wouldn't if the issuance was out of, say, Germany or France, I think that is going to have a significant impact on where businesses base themselves and where they issue from.
Yeah. So it's probably in the UK's interest to aim to be at least one of the best places to do crypto business in the world.
I think that's right, and it would be comparable to government policy generally in terms of things like the overall corporation tax rate, where obviously there's a need to ensure that the government raises adequate revenue, but equally the government has had an eye to the comparable rates in other jurisdictions.
Yeah, and I know that as I mentioned earlier, you're a partner for DLA Piper, who have been generous in providing the facilities for Team Blockchain and the events that we've often talked about on ICO Radio. So, thank you for your part in that.
You're welcome.
Tell us a bit about the role that the firm has been playing and will be playing going forward, in this arena.
Well, we obviously have a very large finance, legal finance and tax department. So from the finance perspective, as ICOs become more highly regulated, larger in scale, etc., we can ensure that they are documented properly and that we sort of cover off any legal risks associated with them. So that might be a documentation point, but it might be equally dealing with the legal regulatory issues as the regulatory environment emerges and matures. And from a tax perspective, we can look at the precise features of a transaction in tandem with the lawyers who are drafting the documents, and we can make sure that none of these sort of tax issues that we've been talking about arise, or at least that we can predict what they're going to be in advance.
Yeah, well, I'd like to keep in touch as we go forward, because I'd love to have your insights going forward as to the kind of things that people should be thinking about as the field progresses. So that'd be great. I've got one other question for you, if I may.
Sure.
You mentioned when we were chatting earlier that there's some differences in the way that cryptocurrencies, as opposed to tokens, are viewed or treated from a tax point of view. Tell me about that.
Well, I think there are differences on the direct tax side, but I think there are some differences which will be relevant right across the EU on the VAT side as well. So where you have a cryptocurrency that simply has no other function other than as a medium of exchange, I think it's likely that, to all intents and purposes, that will be treated from a VAT perspective as a currency. Where you have something that's a sort of more complex token, there are some quite interesting questions around what the treatment of that would be from a VAT perspective. I think the hope and expectation is that actually it would be treated as a financial asset and therefore either outside the scope or exempt from VAT. But at the moment, that is not completely certain. And traditionally the VAT legislation takes a very, very long time to catch up with developments in industry. And so that may be something that stays uncertain for some time to come.
Okay, so this has been fascinating. There's it's the beginning, not the end of a story, isn't it?
I think that's right.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to talking further over the coming weeks and months. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben.
ICO Radio was brought to you by author, speaker, transparency and clarity advocate and award-winning software innovator Barry James. Get in touch with the programme, put yourself or someone else forward as a guest, visit iconewsdesk.com. And if you've enjoyed the show, please leave a review. And don't forget to subscribe to get your next insights and interviews from the ICO Radio podcast.